"You'll never touch that cockpit again," the colonel shouted, and the sound of it cracked off the corrugated steel walls of the hangar like a rifle report. Sarah Kessler did not flinch. She stood in the wash of the floodlights with rain still running off her jacket in thin ropes, her hands loose at her sides, her boots planted the way they had been planted 100 times before in places this man would never be cleared to know about. Behind her, half in shadow near the fuel line, a young crew chief named Danny Ochoa had frozen mid-step, a fire extinguisher forgotten in his hands, watching the colonel's face and then watching hers, and understanding, in some wordless animal way, that he had just watched two very different kinds of certainty collide. Nobody in that hangar could see the thin white line that ran along the inside of her left forearm, hidden now beneath a wet sleeve, or the way her eyes had already measured the windsock, the ceiling, the fuel gauges on the aircraft behind her, before the colonel had finished his sentence. A flight instructor who taught teenagers how to trim a Cessna for cross-country solos. A woman the base was about to lose and never know it. If you've never heard a story like this before, I hope you'll stay for this one, because it earns the ending. And if this is your first time here, welcome. This channel tells the stories of women whose quiet competence gets mistaken for smallness, right up until the moment it can't be anymore. Now, let's get into it. 14 hours before the colonel ever raised his voice at her, Sarah Kessler was standing on the tarmac at Cedar Ridge Airfield, a gravel-adjacent strip of asphalt 50 minutes outside Bozeman, Montana, walking a pre-flight inspection on a Cessna 172 with a 19-year-old student named Priya Anand, trailing half a step behind her, notebook in hand. The airfield did not slow down for sunrise. It never did. By 6 in the morning, the fuel truck was already grumbling along the taxiway, and the coffee in the flight office had gone bitter from sitting on the burner since 4. Sarah moved the way she always moved, which was to say deliberately, without hurry, her fingers running along the leading edge of the wing, checking the control surfaces, tapping the fuel sumps, reading the aircraft the way another person might read a familiar face for signs of trouble. She had spent 11 years learning to notice the difference between an aircraft that was fine and an aircraft that was fine for now, and the distinction had kept people alive more than once, though nobody at Cedar Ridge knew that or had any reason to. "You always do it in the same order," Priya said, not quite a complaint. "Left wing, nose, right wing, tail, every time, even when it's obviously fine." "It's fine because I check it the same way every time," Sarah said. "The day I start skipping steps because I'm sure is the day something skips me." Priya laughed a little, the way students did when an instructor said something that sounded like a fortune cookie, not yet understanding that it was the truest sentence Sarah owned. Her knee ached on the cold mornings, an old injury she attributed vaguely to hiking when anyone asked, which nobody really did. Her hands, when they weren't occupied, tended to go still in a way that looked like calm and was actually readiness, a body that had spent years being told to hold position and had never entirely stood down. She had not slept more than 5 hours a night and longer than she could remember. Not from insomnia exactly, but from a low internal hum that never fully switched off, an idle throttle that had been set somewhere else a long time ago and never reset. The younger instructors at Cedar Ridge thought she was cold. She overheard it once, in the break room, someone saying she was hard to read, that she never laughed at the right moments, that she looked at people the way a mechanic looks at an engine. It didn't wound her the way it might have wounded someone else. She had made a kind of peace with being misread. What she had not made peace with, not entirely, was how quickly that read would change the moment someone needed her to be exactly what she'd been trained to be, and how she would go back to being merely Sarah, the quiet flight instructor, an hour after that need had passed. She had learned to live inside that gap. Most days, it didn't cost her anything to stand in it. What none of them knew, not Priya, not the airfield manager, not the mechanics who nodded at her in the mornings, was that 4 years earlier, in the high, dry mountains east of Kandahar, Sarah Kessler had flown MH6 Little Bird sorties for a task force whose name did not appear in any public record under a call sign that had, for 18 months, made grown rangers go quiet on the radio when they heard it key up, Nightbird. It was not a name she had chosen. It had been given to her after a night extraction in weather that had grounded 2 other aircraft. A run through a valley so narrow the rotor tips had felt close enough to touch stone on both sides, carrying two wounded operators out from a compound that should not have still been standing when she got there. The name had stuck the way names like that stick, passed between men who did not know her face but knew the sound of her voice on the radio staying level when nothing about the situation was level at all. Her last deployment had ended on a ridge in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. In the final weeks of a rotation nobody discussed afterward, in circumstances that had cost her the hearing in one ear for 6 months, and had cost the man in the seat behind her considerably more. She did not talk about it, not because it was too painful to speak of, though some days it was, but because she had learned exactly what happened to her room the moment people found out. The questions changed. The eyes changed. People began listening to her differently, waiting for the story instead of hearing what she was actually saying. And she had decided, somewhere over the Atlantic on the flight home, that she would rather be underestimated for the rest of her life than spend it being handled. Colonel Richard Ashford had commanded the 219th Air Support Wing out of the Regional Air National Guard Base for 19 years, and in that time he had built, by most honest measures, a solid record. He was not a cruel man. He believed, with a conviction that had calcified slowly and without his noticing, that the systems he enforced, rank, protocol, chain of command, the careful sequencing of who was permitted to do what, and when were the only things standing between order and catastrophe. He had seen, early in his career, what happened when good intentions bypassed procedure, and the memory of it had shaped him into a man who trusted structure over instinct. Credentials over competence he could not verify on paper. Somewhere in those 19 years, that trust in structure had hardened into something else, a need to be the one who decided what counted as legitimate authority in any room he stood in. He was not looking to humiliate anyone. He simply could not conceive of a scenario where the correct answer wasn't the one that matched his org chart. He had a habit, small and mostly unnoticed by himself, of addressing junior enlisted personnel and civilian contractors by their function rather than their name, the driver, the tech, the instructor, a linguistic tic that flattened people into their roles before he'd spoken 10 words to them. The storm that grounded half the state's air traffic that evening had not been forecast to reach the base until well past midnight. It arrived 4 hours early, a fast-moving system dragging 70-knot gusts and near-zero visibility across 3 counties. And it caught a Black Hawk medevac crew mid-transport with a critically injured Guardsman aboard, forcing an emergency diversion to the nearest lit strip, which happened to be Cedar Ridge. Sarah was closing up the flight office when the radio call came through, a request for any qualified pilot on the field who could help coordinate a ground handoff in conditions the primary crew hadn't trained for at this specific, unfamiliar strip. She was in her truck and moving toward the tarmac before she'd finished deciding to go. What she did in the next 11 minutes, she did without asking permission from anyone. Because there was no time to ask, and because some part of her had never entirely stopped operating on the assumption that competence acts first and explains later. She read the wind shift off the windsock in the tree line before the anemometer had caught up to it. She waved the Black Hawk crew chief toward a different approach vector than the one he'd been given, shaving 40 degrees off a landing pattern that would have put the aircraft broadside to a gust that hadn't arrived yet but was 3 minutes out and visible, if you knew where to look, in the way the low clouds were tearing. She positioned Danny Ochoa and 2 other ground crew with lights in a configuration that gave the pilot a clean sightline through blowing rain. When the aircraft touched down, hard but controlled, on a strip its crew had never worked before, in weather that had no business allowing it, she was already moving toward the wounded Guardsman's stretcher, calling out vitals to the flight medic in a clipped, exact cadence that made the young medic's head snap up in surprise. She stepped back the second the medic had him. Nobody had thanked her yet. She hadn't been waiting for it. Colonel Ashford arrived by ground vehicle 9 minutes after the Black Hawk had landed. Summoned by his own base's operations center once word came through of an unscheduled diversion involving a guard aircraft, he walked into a scene that, from where he stood, looked like chaos, narrowly avoided by luck, a civilian flight instructor directing his aircrew, redirecting a landing pattern that hadn't come from him. Hovering over a wounded soldier she had no medical authorization to touch. He did not see the 40 seconds that had been saved. He saw a woman who was not in his chain of command giving orders on his tarmac, "Who authorized you to redirect that landing?" he said, and his voice already carried the particular edge of a man who has decided the answer will be unsatisfactory before he's heard it. "Nobody," Sarah said. There wasn't time to ask. The wind was going to put him sideways into that gust on his original approach. "You're a flight instructor." He said the word instructor the way a man discards a coin that turned out to be foreign currency. "You teach teenagers to land a Cessna in calm air. You do not make tactical calls for a military aircrew in a storm." "I made a call because I saw something the crew chief couldn't see from his position," she said. And her voice did not rise to meet his. It stayed level, the way a physician's voice stays level when delivering news a family doesn't want. You can be angry about the chain of command after. Right now, your soldier's stable because of 40 seconds nobody had to spend arguing about who was allowed to say something. You are a civilian. Ashford's jaw was tight now, his voice climbing. You have no idea what you almost caused out here tonight. If that pilot had deferred to your call and you'd been wrong, I wasn't wrong. That's not the point. He was closer now. Close enough that Danny Ochoa, still holding the forgotten fire extinguisher near the fuel line, could see the muscle working in the colonel's cheek. The point is that a chain of command exists so that decisions in a crisis don't come down to whoever's standing closest and feels confident. You had no business. I'd do it again, Sarah said quietly. Tonight, tomorrow, in the same weather. I'd rather explain myself to you after than explain to that boy's mother why nobody said anything. It was the stillness in her that undid him, more than the words. Ashford had spent 19 years learning to read insubordination, and what he was looking at did not fit the shape of it. There was no defiance in her posture, no heat in her face. She stood the way a person stands when they have long since stopped needing anyone's permission to be certain about what they know, and something about that stillness reached past his rank insignia and his 19 years, and landed directly in the part of him that had once, a long time ago, before the calcification, recognized real authority when he saw it stand in front of him without flinching. He didn't have language for what he was feeling. He only knew that his anger, which had felt so clean and so justified 30 seconds earlier, had started to feel like it was reaching for something that kept sliding out of its grip. "You'll never touch that cockpit again," he said, louder than he meant to, grabbing for the only kind of authority he still felt certain of. "Not this one. Not any aircraft on this field while I'm in command of it. I want you off this tarmac." The wounded guardsman on the stretcher, a 22-year-old specialist named Marcus Webb with a collapsed lung and a face gone the color of wet ash, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The flight medic crouched beside him, swore under his breath, and looked up, panic breaking across her face for the first time since the aircraft had landed. "He's dropping sats falling. I've got decreased breath sounds on the left. I think that lung's going again." Sarah was already moving before the medic finished the sentence, dropping to her knees on the wet tarmac beside the stretcher, her hands finding his chest with a precision that came from someplace far older than her civilian certifications. "Look at his trachea," she said, not to Ashford, not to anyone in particular, her voice cutting clean through the rain. "It's shifted right. That's a tension pneumo, not a simple one. He needs a needle decompression in the next 90 seconds, or his heart's going to stop from the pressure, not the injury." "That's not your call to make," Ashford said. But the words had gone thin, uncertain. A man watching the ground shift under a sentence he'd already committed to. "I'd prefer to keep it on," Sarah said, not to him, to the medic. Nodding at the chest seal she was pressing flat with 2 fingers, her hands utterly steady in a way that made the young medic's own hands stop shaking just from watching them. "Count how many seconds he has left before that pressure stops his heart. You don't have 90. You have maybe 60. She had gone very still in the way she did, a stillness that was not calm exactly, but something adjacent to it. A held breath extended across an entire body, the particular quiet of someone who had learned that the loudest thing in a crisis is usually the wrong thing to be. It was in that stillness, more than in anything she said, that the balance of the hangar tilted. Headlights swept across the tarmac as a second vehicle arrived, a gray sedan that had clearly been driving faster than the weather recommended, and a man stepped out in a flight suit with a name patch that read WEBB and rank insignia that made Ashford's spine straighten on reflex, a full colonel from Joint Special Operations Command, summoned the moment word of a Guardsman down, had reached channels far above the 219th because the wounded specialist on that stretcher happened to be the nephew of a general who did not wait for morning briefings when family was involved. Colonel Frank Reyes crossed the tarmac at a near run, dropped to a crouch beside the stretcher without a word of greeting to anyone, and froze. He was looking at Sarah's hands, specifically at the faint white scar tracing the inside of her left forearm where her sleeve had ridden up, a thin line that curved just so. The kind of scar that comes from a very specific piece of shrapnel taking a very specific path. 4 years earlier in a valley whose name never made it into any newspaper. He did not move for 3 full seconds. Then his eyes went to her face, and something in his own face, a man who had spent 26 years learning not to be surprised by anything, simply stopped functioning the way a face is supposed to function. "Nightbird," he said, so quietly that only Sarah and Danny Ochoa, still frozen near the fuel line, actually heard it. The word landed in the hangar like a dropped weight. Ashford's head turned. "What did you say?" Reyes straightened, and in the space of a single motion, the tarmac reconfigured itself around a piece of information nobody else in that hangar had possessed 30 seconds earlier. He came to attention and rendered a salute so crisp it looked rehearsed. Though it was not, it was the reflex of a man who had once flown 3 missions under this woman's call sign without ever seeing her face, and who had spent 4 years assuming he never would. "Captain Kessler," he said, "I pulled 2 men off a mountain in Kunar because you flew into weather that grounded everyone else on that field. I didn't know your name until right now. I've known your voice for 4 years. The hangar had gone silent except for the rain drumming the metal roof, and the beeping of the monitor. Sarah was still watching, her fingers unmoved from the chest seal, her attention already back on the specialist beneath her hands. Because whatever this was, it could wait 90 more seconds, and he could not. "He needs that decompression now," she said, flat, urgent, cutting through the moment like it wasn't happening. "Somebody get me a 14 gauge and betadine, or hand me your kit if you're carrying one. Colonel, do you have a needle kit in that vehicle?" Reyes was already moving, pulling a field kit from his sedan, kneeling beside her, handing her the needle without a flicker of hesitation. Because whatever rank separated them on paper had just evaporated in favor of a much older hierarchy, the one built entirely out of who had actually done the thing in front of them before. Sarah found the landmark with 2 fingers, exhaled once, and drove the needle home with a controlled economy of motion that made the flight medic beside her go quiet with something like awe. The hiss of released pressure was audible even over the rain. Specialist Webb's chest, which had been rising in shallow, panicked increments, dropped and then rose again, deep and even, and the color began, slowly, to come back into his face. "Sat's climbing," the medic said, disbelief in her voice. 91, 94, he's stabilizing." Sarah didn't look up. "He'll need a chest tube within the hour, and imaging to make sure there's no ongoing bleed. Somebody call ahead to Deaconess and tell them tension pneumo. Needle decompression at." She checked her watch. 21:52. Patient's a 22-year-old male. No other visible trauma, but check his ribs on the left. There was resistance when I found the landmark that shouldn't have been there.
Danny Ochoa, still holding the fire extinguisher he had apparently forgotten he was carrying, found his voice for the first time since the colonel had shouted. "I'll radio it in," he said, and ran. It was not the last decision Sarah made that night, only the first of several. While the ground ambulance was still 4 minutes out, she noticed the medic's hands beginning to shake in earnest, now that the immediate crisis had a floor under it. The particular delayed shaking that comes after fear has been outrun and finally catches up, and she put a hand briefly on the woman's shoulder and told her, in a voice that had dropped its urgency and found something almost gentle instead, that she'd done everything right, that the call to divert had saved him, that the shaking would pass in a few minutes and she should let it. When the ambulance crew arrived, she gave them a handoff report, so precise and so complete mechanism of injury, interventions performed, vitals trend, time markers, that the lead paramedic asked, without any irony at all, what unit she was currently assigned to. She told him, simply, that she used to fly. He didn't ask anything further. Something in her voice made clear that the door on the question had already closed. Colonel Ashford stood near the edge of the tarmac through all of it, doing something small and useful that no one had asked of him. Holding a flashlight steady on the stretcher so the medic's hands were free. Saying nothing. His earlier certainty gone the way of fever breaks, leaving him hollowed out and a little unsteady on his feet. He was watching a woman he had ordered off his tarmac 40 minutes ago run a trauma scene with a competence that made his own 19 years feel, for the first time in a long while, provisional. When the ambulance pulled away, red lights fading into the rain-streaked dark, Reyes found Sarah near the hangar door, out of the direct light, where she had gone to be alone for a minute before anyone could ask her anything. He didn't say much at first. He held out a challenge coin, worn smooth at the edges, the kind carried by men who don't hand them out casually. "I've carried this 4 years hoping I'd get the chance to give it to whoever flew that extraction," he said. "I never thought it'd be a flight instructor in Montana." She turned it over once in her fingers, feeling the familiar weight of it, and handed it back to him, gently, without ceremony. "Keep it," she said. "I'm not her anymore, not in the way you mean. You flew tonight like nothing's changed. Flying's not the part that changed." She looked past him, out at the rain, at the wet tarmac, where an aircraft had landed 40 minutes ago in weather it had no business surviving. "The part that changed is I get to choose who needs me now. That night in Kunar, I didn't get to choose. Tonight, I did. That's the whole difference, and it matters to me more than you probably think it should." Reyes studied her for a long moment, then nodded, and didn't press it. He put the coin back in his pocket instead of insisting, which she noted, quietly, as a kind of respect she hadn't expected from a man wearing that much rank. Colonel Ashford found her 20 minutes later, near her truck, keys already in hand. He did not offer excuses, and he did not perform an apology with the careful legal hedging man in his position so often reached for. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at his own hands the way a man looks at hands that have just done something they're no longer sure they understand, and said, "I was wrong about what you were capable of. I don't think I was wrong to want a chain of command that people follow. But tonight I mistook the chain of command for the only thing worth trusting, and I nearly cost that boy his life over it." He paused. "I don't expect you to make that easier for me." "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Sarah said. "It wasn't, but I understand what you were trying to protect. You were just protecting the wrong thing tonight." She opened her truck door. "There's a difference between respecting rank and worshipping it. Might be worth sitting with that." He didn't answer, and she didn't wait for one. She had said what needed saying, and she had never needed the last word to know she meant it. 3 days later, Sarah Kessler was back at Cedar Ridge Airfield at 6 a.m, walking a pre-flight inspection on the same Cessna 172, Priya Anand half a step behind her with the same notebook. She checked the left wing, the nose, the right wing, the tail, in the same order she always checked them, her fingers finding the same familiar surfaces, her knee aching faintly in the cold, the way it always did. Word of what had happened on the tarmac had moved through the small airfield, the way word moves through small places, in fragments and rumors that never quite matched what had actually occurred. And a few of the younger instructors had started looking at her differently, with a curiosity she declined, gently but completely, to satisfy. She had never needed the world to know her name. She needed to be somewhere she was useful, and she had always known exactly where that was, sometimes in a cockpit 40 feet off a mountainside, and sometimes on a folding chair beside a 19-year-old learning to trim an aircraft for straight and level flight, and there was less difference between the two than most people would ever guess. There's something in Sarah Kessler's story that stays with you long after it ends, and it isn't the reveal itself, though the reveal is the part people want to talk about. It's the 11 minutes before anyone knew her name, the 40 seconds she spent redirecting a landing pattern nobody had authorized her to touch, the years she'd spent being read as cold by people who had never once needed her to be anything else. We build our categories out of what people are holding when we meet them. A mop, a clipboard, an instructor's headset, and we mistake the container for the thing itself, forgetting that competence doesn't announce itself, doesn't wear a uniform that matches the moment, doesn't wait for permission to notice a shifted trachea or a wind shift 3 minutes out. Colonel Ashford spent 19 years building a structure he trusted more than his own eyes. And it took one storm and one woman he'd already dismissed to show him the difference between a chain of command and the actual, unglamorous work of keeping people alive. Sarah never asked him to see it. She just kept doing the work in front of her, the way she always had, whether anyone was watching or not. That, in the end, is the kind of integrity that doesn't need an audience, the kind that shows up at 6 a.m. to check a wing in the same order it always has, long after the applause, if there ever was any, has gone quiet. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet competence is still competence, even when nobody's counting it. And if you haven't already, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next. These stories exist because you keep showing up for them. Thank you.